LBSW and has been involved in different forms of counseling over her professional career. She's a state licensed social worker, a trauma and loss school specialist. She holds a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's degree in counseling. She has been a probation officer, so don't anybody misbehave, a junior high social studies teacher, high school counselor, and is currently the assistant superintendent of curriculum and student services for Columbus ISD. Esther, we're so glad you're here tonight, and just thank you so much for coming. Why don't you come and share with us what's on your heart tonight? Let's welcome Esther.
All very kind, and what a blessing it is for me to be here tonight with y'all. Sherry and I have visited many times, and she had asked when this really seed for this ministry really opened in her heart, talked about kind of the path of how things would go. I know y'all have visited and planned, and what a blessing this will be. And so it's just it's a very wonderful thing. And I think it's something that will have long-lasting benefits for folks all over. The website's great. And so I think all of that's such a wonderful thing. Well, Sherry asked if I would share a few things about the 5 stages of grief. And the junior high teacher, high school counselor in me comes out, and I've got a handout. So, if you don't mind taking one in passing. You know, we always have to have paper. Don't we, Mr. Cates? It's always a good thing to have some of that. I can say that really the whole topic of the stages of grief really came from a secular place. It came from researchers. It was a mom and her son who worked with families who were suffering loss. And what they did was really kind of look at some of the commonalities of experiences people have with loss. The different ranges of loss. Pastor Bitchie mentioned are so true. It could be loss of a livelihood that someone feels like they can't support their family any longer. There's obviously death is a huge loss. There's ranges of loss. This research is based on loss as a result of death. And they took these stages or these manifestations of grief that they saw, and they put them kind of in a framework. And it's just like building a house, really. You set up kind of an outside structure, and you can hang things on that structure that build your individual home. Well, this framework of grief are really those pillars and construction supports for everyone's individual grief path. And so it's important to keep in mind it's not a linear timeline, and it's not something that is a constant one-way direction. There may be times that you revisit a stage, or you may go back and skip 2 stages forward. It is so truly a process, and it is so truly one of those things that's individual. I've done lots of trauma and loss work in schools. And I've been called in at schools where the loss just happened 12 hours earlier, and it was multiple students, or a teacher that had passed maybe 36 hours earlier. There's different intervals along the way. And one thing I've noticed in the many different schools that I've been called into that capacity for is that whether it was right after the loss or it was 36 hours to a week after the loss, people are, no matter where they're at in respect to the time of the loss, they're in a different spot in the grieving. So I say that to say everyone's going to do it differently. There's no litmus test for if you're grieving appropriately, if you're on the right track, if you're moving fast enough. None of that matters because it is so individual. So when we look at the stages of grief, we need to keep in mind that it is individual. It has to, it really accepts the fact what type of loss it is, all those individual factors, where we're at spiritually affects us, even though this study was done in a real secular manner. I'm not going to read this to you, but I went back through and I just underlined things that I thought really stood out for me out of these. I took this straight from the website and the research that these folks have done. But the things I underlined have really kind of stuck out with me for different reasons of just the different experiences that I've had. They say the first stage is really denial. Denial is very different depending, again, on what the individual loss is. But it's really basically trying to find a way to get through the day. And it's not, very few times have I seen people say, oh no, this really didn't happen. They know it happened. They feel the loss. They're trying to find a way just to get through the next, sometimes, hour. So it is a very individual thing. Because you do accept the reality of loss and you start to ask yourself questions, but you are unknowingly beginning the healing process. When you start to inquire and you start thinking past, okay, I've had this incident occur, you've really taken the first step. Anger, I think as a society and as spending so many years in the counseling social work profession, it seems like there are courses on anger management. It's kind of the thing that anger isn't a good thing and we're supposed to really kind of suppress it. I think society says that. But there are points where anger is definitely an acceptable response because it is a loss. And it's really kind of a way to almost link to the intensity of love for that person or that situation that is no longer there. So it isn't if, one of the things I never tell people in any kind of situation is, well, don't be angry. It's okay to be angry because there is a loss there. And that you're just really kind of reflecting the intensity of love, I believe. They say the bargaining stage is next. One of the lines that I underlined, we become lost in a maze of if only or what if statements. What if we could return life to how it was? And one of the things that are most attached to the bargaining stage is that sense of guilt that we feel as someone that's still here or someone that's dealing with it. And so that bargaining guilt attachment, we have to kind of watch out for because people can really kind of get fixated in the guilt because from what I've seen, sometimes it's easier to take responsibility for a loss that has occurred than to accept I had no control over it and God's in control and this is what has happened. Kind of defaults to the, well, I should have done this. And that's a section of grief I think that's not as healthy. It's not as healthy of a way to really get that out. Depression. People that don't experience depression after a loss, that is not usual. It is the norm to be depressed. And I think some of the responses to people who are in that stage, I think it's very, I believe they need to be very purposeful. Because we cannot go in and judge and say, oh, well, you shouldn't feel sad because think about this. Or, what about this? No. I think it's a respecter of that person's individual process as well as the impact of that loss. On a personal note, just to use as an illustration, both my parents passed years ago. My brother died about 5 years ago, and I was the caretaker for my mom. My dad died when I was about 30. It was a very long kind of process losing both of my parents. Well, but when my brother died, I was very surprised that hit me harder than when my own mom died. And some of the things about grief, and I say that just to say that some things with grief you don't expect. And even with all the trauma and grief training that I've had, when it hits you personally, it's a very different matter. And I kept thinking, well, why does it bother me? Why am I more grieving? And why am I sadder that my brother's gone than my own mom? And some of that was because of the suddenness of his death. And then the relationship he and I had, because she had been sick for quite a long time. And I had folks tell me, they said, well, that was just your brother who passed. But you weren't like this when your mom passed. And I had to really kind of pull back and say, they really don't understand the correlation between loss, grief, individual relationships. It is quite a complex structure. And that goes back to the fact that the 5 stages of grief, any of these grieving processes, they're just a framework. And it's how your individual experience really kind of tags on to that. Acceptance, they say, is the very last stage. Most people don't ever feel okay or all right about the loss. So when they say, oh, you're to the acceptance, you'll be there one day, the loss never really goes away. To me, the acceptance factor is you're able to move forward. And I think one of the best ways to move forward is really doing what y'all are doing, is you're reaching out to help others. And I think acceptance at its best is really doing that. It's turning your grief into serving others. Because we can go on, make meaningful relationships, move forward, but the loss never rejuvenates back. There are some common physical manifestations of grief that people may act like everything's fine and they're going through their day, but if it's a female especially, cry suddenly and don't really understand why, have headaches, trouble sleeping, either they can't or they sleep too much, eat too little. And one of the things that I've seen over the years is that the smallest thing, people can think everything's going okay, they're pretty solidified in that acceptance realm in the stages, and all of a sudden something happens and it just like brings the floodgate of emotion back. It can be something as simple as a smell, someone's cologne, finding an empty bottle of their cologne. It could be a painting. And those are those unexpected little bombshells, and I say little, and they can be quite large, that will hit a person once you've had a loss. And so that's why on the acceptance phase, it's really always working through that, because you will have those little nuggets, those little memories that will just pop up and you're really not expecting it. But when you're able to cope, move forward, then that is really the best I think it gets, is because you're able to take that, turn it into serving others, moving forward, but the loss never goes away. And it's something that's really dealing with, I think, all the way through our lives. I'd like to close with a story. I don't know if any of you folks are kind of Kennedy watchers. I've always been intrigued. I'm kind of a historical type, and kind of watch the Kennedy family and different things and read the books, all that. There's a documentary out by Ethel and Bobby Kennedy's youngest daughter, Rory. And Bobby, her dad, was assassinated before she was born. And this was a documentary that Rory was doing, and she was interviewing her mom about these major historical things that had happened in their life and their personal lives. Well, and she went through all the political instances. She went through how deeply affected Bobby was when JFK was assassinated, how they coped with that, how she helped Bobby cope with that. And then, of course, she addressed the fact when Bobby was assassinated also, and they had 11 children together. After Bobby passed, she buried 2 of her children, one to a drug overdose and then one to a skiing accident. And I don't know if y'all have ever seen Ethel Kennedy in any type of interview. She doesn't grant them often, but she's very forthright, and she's very clear, and she's very purposeful. And her daughter just came out and asked her, she said, "Mom, how did you cope with that? How could you live with that and raise 11 children and bury 2? How did you do that?" And her reply was so succinct and solid. And she said, "I know that your daddy is with his brother. They are in heaven with the Lord, and I will be there too." And that was her strength to get through. And I thought, Ethel couldn't have said it better myself. Way to go. Because that is so true. That is our hope. And these frameworks of guilt, these things are earthly supports to try to help us. But the ultimate help and the healer, and everyone will be well in heaven, and we will see them over there. And that has been her hope. And so for those who have lost loved ones, that is our hope. For those who have lost their livelihood, for those who have had separation from children, that is still our hope. And God bless all of you.